want to start this review with a shout out to Chris Morrison. Chris is the host of Gulfside Ministries. I'll put a link to his YouTube channel in the description below, but I always got to support my fellow YouTubers from the Gulf Coast, and Chris puts great content out on biblical exposition, Christian philosophy, and even how to learn a New Testament Greek. I begin with a shout out to Chris because without him, I would have never heard of this author, Tom Ekman, whose book, Prophet, Priest, and King, I am now reviewing. This is my second X-Men book that I've reviewed on the channel. I also reviewed his commentary on James, and Chris has emailed me both of Tom's books on James and now this one on Matthew. And I enjoyed this book so much that I wanted to give Chris a shout out for bringing Tom's work to my attention. So please, Chris, if Tom Ekman keeps writing books, you can just keep sending them my way. Today's review covers Tom Ekman's 2003 release, Prophet, Priest, and King, Jesus, the Messiah, in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, the title is a little long, and it also might make the reader think that this is a standard commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. And while it's like a commentary, it's close to a commentary, it's not quite a commentary on Matthew's Gospel. What Tom does is examine the unique portions of Matthew's Gospel in comparison to Mark and Luke, the other synoptics. And what he shows is that Matthew provides this unique Jewish focus. And the portions of Matthew that are different than Mark and Luke, you really only understand them if you read them as an ancient Jew. And so Tom doesn't go through all of this book. He skips very large portions of it, but he covers what some would consider the most difficult parts of the book and shows you how to understand them from the correct perspective. And I enjoyed this book throughout. This is the second time I'm going to say Tom Ekman did an excellent job teaching through the text and also doing so in a way that is engaging for the reader and very readable. So if you have a few moments, allow me to tell you a little bit more about Prophet, Priest, and King. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to understand the gospel narratives, please subscribe to the channel in order to stay up to date with my latest review, and also like and share this video to help other people know about the work of Tom Ekman. And I want to say thank you to the Buy Me a Coffee members whose support allows me to cover the costs of keeping up with Rev Reads and putting out these new book reviews. If you have benefited from Rev Reads, I would love you to consider supporting the channel. Memberships start at only $3 a month. From Tom's perspective in this book, one of the keys to understanding the Gospel of Matthew as a whole, and especially understanding those parts of Matthew that set it apart from Mark and Luke, is to see that Matthew was written from a Jewish perspective by a Jewish author to a Jewish audience. For instance, when talking about the kingdom that John the Baptist and Jesus were speaking of, you should be thinking about what would be the Jewish expectations of that kingdom. And I think Ekman is spot on, that the expectations for a Jewish kingdom would be based on the prophets we find in the Hebrew Bible. And they tell us that the kingdom that they're looking for is a kingdom that first has a king, and that king is the Messiah. It'll be at a specific place. Jerusalem will be the capital city of a unified nation of Israel, and also a very specific time period. And that is a period described as peace, prosperity, and security. And how should those elements view how we think about the kingdom of God and kingdom of heaven? And I think the only one real place of disagreement that I have with Tom is seeing the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of God as two separate entities. I think they probably describe the same, but that's the one place of disagreement I think I might have had with him in this entire book. Pretty much everything else was right on line, and that's a relatively minor point in the book. And what Tom does is helps the reader see how John the Baptist would have viewed the kingdom from his Jewish Old Testament prophet's perspective, and why Matthew's account of his ministry stands out from the presentations of John the Baptist that we see in the other gospel accounts, and why we should probably see John's baptism as something that was for the Jews. It was a Jewish baptism. I thought his work connecting the Beatitudes to Jesus' words about repenting for the kingdom of God at hand were excellent, and also his focus on the earthly nature of those Beatitudes was welcome as well. We need to remember that those who live out the Beatitudes, they are inheriting the earth. They are not inheriting heaven. For me, though, the highlight of the book was Ekman's coverage of the seven kingdom parables in Matthew 13. His instruction on how we need to see those seven parables. Am I holding up seven fingers here? We need to see those seven parables as a unit and hold them together, interpret them with one line. And that was all so good. He helped to show that one of the problems that a lot of interpreters have in these parables where they get lost is that they take one or two of the parables and then disconnect them from the whole, and that throws off the entire train of parables. But I think you can understand why people do that when you begin to connect all the train cars of this parable together. And that is, if you stick with the images, if you remain consistent throughout, the picture of the images isn't what a lot of people want to see Jesus teaching, especially as it regards to the church in this area, this time period before his second advent. Few people will expect Jesus to be the one buying the treasure in the field because they like the idea that we need to have a call, that we need to give up all that we have, all that we are, in order to purchase salvation. And then there's a special highlight, at least for me, on the parable on the leaven. And Tom does a masterful job showing how that parable fits in the line of seven, and also pulling out the significance of leaven in the Bible as a whole. And to hold that parable as being what happens when false teaching becomes mixed in and becomes more and more pervasive among God's people until the return of Christ, I thought he did really good exegesis to pull that out of the parable. He's clearly pulling truth out of the text and not inserting his own ideology into these parables, which sometimes is hard to do with parables because I think a lot of us feel like we can twist them and align them to fit with what we want to come into the text and believe. I also loved his work on Matthew chapter 20 and the parable of the landowner and the laborers. That's the parable where all the laborers work different amounts of time during the day and then end up receiving the same amount of wages at the end. I think that that parable ranks up in my mind as one of the most misunderstood parables in the Gospels. And Tom, oh, it was so good. His exegesis and commentary on it, showing that one of the keys to Matthew 20 is to tie it to what happens in Matthew 19 and the rich young rulers, and especially the disciples' words in response to the rich young ruler. I have never seen in writing someone else tie those two together, which is something that I do when I teach on that passage. And for that alone, people should read this book. As one would expect, there's quality work in this book on the end of the book covering the Olivet Discourse, with the basic understanding that if you don't see the Olivet Discourse from the right perspective, you're not going to get what Jesus is saying in the details. Overall, man, this book was really helpful. And when I started it, I was a little bit like, man, I'm not going to be teaching or preaching through Matthew for a while. So I don't really know if I want to read a commentary on Matthew right now, but I read it anyways because I liked Tom's work on James so much, and I liked this one just as much. And I think this book will be eye-opening for a lot of the people who read it, and I hope that Prophet, Priest, and King has as wide an audience as possible.